Let's start with that because there's a lot about to talk about the Blinken's
Fujian.
visit and of course Yellen's
Yeah, yeah,
visit
yeah.
and
Whatever. Yeah.
yeah, and then Elon Musk also just visited as
Oh, yeah.
well. Yeah, so let's start.
Very different man, I think.
Yeah,
Much more sane, I think.
yes. Okay, so yeah, we can start with the aircraft carrier, the
Whatever
Fujian.
you want, whatever you want, whatever you want.
That's a
Fujian,
good
Fujian.
yeah, that's a good start. The Fujian, yes, the China built it. It's now announced that it's finished, ready
Mm.
to start, right? I guess. And you're saying that it's all over the place. I guess the Western media pay lots of attention to this. But fundamentally, they need to understand that China built these things and not to. Of course, they are going to saying this is for aggression. China is very aggressive. But these are for defense purpose. To be honest, if there are not that many military bases surrounding China, China wouldn't need to build all these things. China actually much prefer to spend money on other things,
Mm.
infrastructure, stuff like that. Isn't that how? But the Western media will portray use that as an evidence that China is getting more and more aggressive. Isn't that's what they're
This is
saying?
ab
Yeah.
well, briefly, you are absolutely right. I mean, if the United States had not been talking about the Pacific Ocean, a gigantic ocean, as an American lake, which they
Hmm.
do, if they
Hmm.
hadn't been talking about Taiwan as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, which they've been doing ever since Douglas MacArthur, the former US military leader, first said that in 1950, if there hadn't been a major build-up by the United States in Taiwan, back going all the way back to 1950 and then resuming again with a vengeance now. If the US Navy hadn't been constantly entering the South China Sea, going close to China, um, interfering in effect with, challenging China's sovereignty, why would China need a naval build-up? There's no evidence that it would do this thing. And of course, the United States has 11 aircraft carriers. It's got a string of bases around the world. China has none of these things, but it's outrageous. It's unacceptable when China has one aircraft carrier as opposed to the 11 that the Americans have. I think there is another important historical point to make, which is that I think what people in the United States completely overlook is that unlike others of its rivals in the past, namely Germany and the Soviet Union and Russia, China has always, throughout its history, been a major maritime power. It has
Hmm.
always conducted trade on an enormous scale. Throughout the Pacific, throughout the world, it conducts trade on an enormous scale. Today, we all know about the famous story of the treasure fleets from China that visited the east coast of Africa during the time of the Ming Dynasty. But that's only one example of many. And of course, again, as somebody who is familiar with Chinese history, I know that during the time of the Qing Dynasty, for example, China increasingly conducted its own internal trade along its along its eastern coasts. It stopped using the great canal system that had
Hmm.
been built because shipping developed beyond that. And of course, it does so to this day. So it is completely understandable that China would want a fleet. It is not an aggressive act, it is entirely a product of the many threats that the United States has been directing at China. And of course, when we have threats also to close the Straits of Malacca, to
Yeah.
impose a sea blockade on China and do all that kind of thing. Well, of course, the Chinese are going to react.
And it's interesting you brought up this Zhenghe's fleet during the Ming Dynasty.
Hmm.
I saw a documentary some years ago, and it's about that. And one of the commentator, I believe his name is Nicholas Kristof. He is the New York Times columnist, and he's comment about that. He said that's the uh, major mistake that China made during the past 300 years or 600 years, because that's a perfect opportunity for Zhenghe to go colonize everything, because at the time they are no rivals and they could do all that, but they didn't. You see, the Chinese historians never look at the Zhenghe's fleet that way. It's
Yeah.
never occurred to them that you send out a fleet to go conquer and then colonize everybody. Now, there were some people on there are some small battles just the pirates and stuff like that. So
Mm.
they encountered some battle, but never in that sense that the
Yeah.
European sense like a colonize. It just gives you the idea, the way of thinking that he think this is the most devastating mistake China made for the past. Otherwise, China would be today's total hegemony, whatever. I don't know. I mean, but you get the idea, right? That how they think about this, that how the Chinese doesn't think that way at all.
It doesn't think that way at all, and it never has done. And again, anybody who knows Chinese history, as I have done, I mean, I've been reading about Chinese history for, well, most of my life, would know that China has never, at any point in its history, sought that kind of global dominance that the United States and Britain and other European powers have sought. It just isn't at all how the Chinese think.
Thinking, yeah.
And that they should go out and want to conquer places. They've never done that. It's just
Yeah.
never been what the Chinese are about. They've always been about building up China. And, Westerners can say this is their big mistake. They didn't do this in the 15th century. Look how mighty they would be today. Well, that's one possible perspective of history.
Yeah.
Go conquer places, enslave people, plunder them, do all of those things. That's the way you succeed and make history and become powerful. The fact is, China was powerful in the 15th century and didn't do that. China is powerful today, and it didn't do that in the 15th century. Perhaps over the long history of time, because a couple of 100 years isn't in historical time that long,
Yeah.
it will be seen that China made entirely the correct decision in the 15th century when it didn't go out and seize countries and enslave them and conquer them and create overseas empires and do all that kind of thing.
Because it's very it costs lots of money and energy. It's to keep an empire, it's very hard, that kind of a global empire that the British did. And right now the United States, right, it's come to a point that I think United States can lose its ability to control everything. We can see it every day now, right? And so to maintain an empire is very in the long run is not workable in my view. And that's probably I would say the Chinese view. But trade is good. That's what the fleet is about. It's about trade. That China has always been for trade, and that's still to this day that China think that trade. Everywhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, that's completely correct, and you're both right about the burden of empire. Empires, of course, are also deeply corrupting. They make you cruel. That has an effect on your own domestic institutions. This was widely understood, by the way, in 18th century Britain. Adam Smith, the famous economist and economic writer, was very opposed to empire. He said, this is a terrible thing we're doing. What we should do is focus on trade. Empire will ultimately destroy us. He was right. So, this is taking a very long-term view of history. I'm afraid Westerners tend not to do that.
Yeah.
They have a much more power-focused view of history, that the pursuit of power is the immediate objective. And in an earlier program, I also said that one of the major problems about Western understanding of China is that they impose Western labels on Chinese things.
Yeah.
So they talk about the Chinese emperor, whereas, of course, the emperor in the West is a military ruler, whereas the Huangdi was not. I mean, that's a completely different conception. They talk about the Chinese Empire, when, of course, there is no such concept in China. It's China. I mean, it's
Yeah.
Zhongguo. It's the
Yeah.
middle. It's the state in the middle. But I mean, there's never been the idea of it being an empire. It is a completely different understanding and philosophy of history, of culture, of political and state organization, which Westerners find very difficult to understand.
And that's probably explains Blinken's visit is such a disaster.
Yeah.
What is your view on that?
Well, I've never in my life seen anything quite like this, actually. Um, you were telling me in our last program that many people in China were asking, why was this person even allowed into China at all? I have to say, when I saw the statement that he made just before he left, I thought the same thing. I mean, he attacked China in the most extreme way in China itself. He raked up again, Tibet and Xinjiang and all of
Mhm.
that, which you've heard about many times. He talked about how America will always defend its values, which at this particular time with what's going on in Gaza and in Middle East, I mean, the throat chokes when one hears things like that. And he brings up overcapacity. He talks about how we've seen this story before: American businesses shuttered, Americans losing their jobs, as if that's China's fault, not America's fault. And that the Chinese are somehow responsible for the fact that the Russians are winning in Ukraine. I mean, it was terrible speech. It was absurd speech. And he goes and says that the United States, respects the one China policy when it clearly doesn't. He
Mhm.
says that the United States wants China to become prosperous when it clearly doesn't. I mean, he lies, and he's provocative and arrogant and aggressive all at the same time. Now, this is diplomacy of a sort that I have never,
Mhm.
it contradicts the very concept behind that word. I mean, there's never been anything like that at any time in history. Well, maybe there was, and I think the Chinese people remember this, was when the British officials came to China in the 1840s and were bullying the Chinese at that time. And we know what happened. And it looks to me as if the Americans are behaving in exactly the same way, except, of course, it's a different China today from the one in the 1840s. They've learnt the difference. The Chinese have learnt since then.
I want to share with you the reactions of the public and the
Mm,
commentators. It's
mm,
very mixed. It is actually all over the place. Now, for one thing, Blinken's speech, the one that you talked about before he left, he was giving a press conference, right? But when he was talking to Wang Yi, to Xi Jinping, he seems like a little bit timid. I feel like he's timid. He didn't really want to say these things on their face, right? And so what the some people are saying, okay, he's here to bully us, just like he always does. Uh, but there's toothless. I mean, there's nothing to pay attention to. And then other people are saying, okay, now they're going to start a sanction, like what you're saying, they're going to sanction. But I have to say that I find the public in general are a little bit tired of this. They lost the kind of lost interest. There's many signs of that. One is if you look at the commentator, there's still a lot of commentators talking about this, but
mm,
not nearly as much as they used to when they
mm,
talk about these things. And then the second thing is if you look at the CCTV's evening news, the Central Television evening news, it used to be when there's a high level US official come, they would cover it like at the moment that he landed, right? And then every
mm,
step of what he's doing after the meeting, is he visiting somewhere there? There's nothing like that. It's a coverage of his meeting with Wang Yi and then his meeting with Xi Jinping, and that was it. And from their coverage is pretty much what you can read on the readout from the foreign minister readout. That's
mm,
it. There's not a whole
mm,
lot other things they cover, which shows me in general and the comments of the netizens, etc. It's like there's nothing new. You come here to bully us, lecture us and threatening
mm,
us. We got it. Okay. Whatever the reason you have to do it, well, fine, you have to do it, but we got it, right? We move forward, we move past you. Whatever you want to do, you want to do. That's the attitude I find that the public is simply tired of it. Now the government is still pretty angry if you from the readout of Xi Jinping and Wang Yi,
mm,
they basically saying you cannot say one thing, do another, which you also talked about a lot in the past.
mm.
So in general, I would say China pretty much decided, okay, whatever you do, we do our thing, you do your thing. That's pretty much my impression.
Oh, I'm sure this is absolutely correct. I mean, I think the Chinese now understand at every level that there is no reasoning with these people, and there's no point in wasting time trying to do that. So you meet him. That's, I think, the position of the Chinese government, because it's better to meet than not. But the Chinese public has made up their mind that this is already, you know, going to be the direction that it's going to take. The Americans are going to behave like that. They're not happy with the fact that China has become prosperous and secure and comfortable with itself. They don't want to see that anymore. They want to see this as a rival. But the Chinese people will go on with their own lives and live their lives and build up their businesses and bring up their families and build up their country. And they're not going to waste their time worrying about what Mr. Blinken and Mr. Biden and all of those people say and think. The Chinese government has to look at this in a different perspective, because it is a virtual certainty, I think, that we're going to get sanctions of some kind
Mhm,
before very long. And it would be very surprising indeed if they didn't affect the Chinese banks in some way. So the
mhm,
Chinese government has to think about how it's going to respond and what it's going to do. You can understand the difference in perspective. But I come back to what I always say: the first law of diplomacy, don't bluff China.
mhm,
And that's essentially what Blinken is doing. He came to China, he made all his threats. The Chinese shrugged their shoulders. They said to him, "We know you're bluffing. Just go away, don't bother us. We are grown up people. We don't want to listen to this."
Well, I have to say, Blinken, if I can summarize what the US want China to do, is no more trade with Russia, no more trade with Iran, because the Congress also passed the bill, sanction whoever doing trade to buy Iranian oil. Okay. No exploitation of the South China Sea, and also the slow the production of the solar panels, the EVs, and even shipbuilding. So there's an investigation of the Chinese shipbuilding, 301 or something violation, something, etc. In other words, to hold China back, right? At the same time, they also want China to buy the U.S. agriculture products. Apparently, there is a deficit. U.S. agriculture export has a deficit, which is surprising. And there's some analysts saying that has something to do with the fact that ever since the trade war started, China have been, shifting its agriculture imported from other countries, and that's hurt the U.S. Agriculture products and also the treasury bonds. So you see all these things that that China will not agree to any of these things to hold China back, right? At the same time, you want China to do something for you. It just doesn't make any sense.
No,
So
no.
why is Blinken still doing that? He just doesn't know there's any other way. It's
I think that the Americans have a colossal sense of entitlement, and I think deep down and fundamentally, they demand that because they feel that that's how the way the world should work. What you've described, that you exploit China economically
Mhm,
and you make China do what you want globally, it's
mhm,
very much, if you actually look at the history of British-Indian relations, what eventually happened between Britain and India. The British took over India. They used India as a market for their industrial goods. They prevented India's economic development. They used India as a source for raw materials and labor. They built up the Indian army um, which was, of course, the British controlled Indian army, to enable the British to enlarge their empire in other places. The Americans want a relationship with China that is not fundamentally that different. They want the Chinese to stop developing their economy, cede control of the seas, run their own country, abandon any thought of reunification with Taiwan,
yeah,
cut off their trade
mhm,
with Russia, and indeed cut off their trade with any country which the United States wants them to cut their trade off with. Essentially, what they want to do is to treat China as a kind of colony. Now, that's not going to happen. It is
yeah,
completely unrealistic. It's an absurd idea. But I don't think the Americans understand how absurd it is, because from their point of view, it's the way the world should be.
mhm,
They just assume that that is the correct the correct way in which
Mhm.
things should be set up. And it's very difficult conceptually for them to think otherwise. Now, of course, the fact is the Chinese will never agree to all of that. And that's why, despite all our hopes, some kind of confrontation between China and the United States is going to happen.
Mhm.
The question is not whether it will happen, it is how well controlled and managed it will be. But the thing to say also is that this confrontation, by definition, again in historical time, cannot last long
Mhm.
because all the trends in history, in modern history, are so obviously contrary to what the Americans feel is the correct way to run the world. I mean, this was an outlook that made sense in the 1950s. It just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, one more thing is that I don't see the report in the Western media, but there's rumors that before Blinken came is that he was supposed to also discuss a possible Biden visit to China. Biden
Oh.
hasn't visited China ever since he took office, which is unusual in a way,
Mm.
because both Obama and Trump they visited China the first year they come into office.
Mm.
And I think before that, quite a few other presidents did the same thing. And
Mm.
so it's a little bit unusual for him not even visited China. Now, maybe in a way they feel that it's good for him to do that, to come for an election year, to come to China if he can show he's tough, his Chinese people see him as some kind of a, very special or whatever, treated him really special. I
Mm.
don't know whether he didn't bring this up, considering how the cold reception he got when he arrived, or he brought it up that the Chinese just didn't respond right away. But
Mm.
there's some rumor that that's one of the purpose, but we didn't see any report on that. What do you think that
Well,
possibility?
interesting because you're absolutely correct. I've not seen a single report about
Yeah.
this in the media here. Now, that doesn't mean that, of course, that idea wasn't being floated. By the way,
Hmm.
I never thought about it, but you're absolutely right. He hasn't visited
Yeah.
China as president, and that's an astonishing thing.
Mm.
I think that quite plausibly, Biden does want, or the administration does want, Biden going to China because you're
Mhm.
correct, absolutely correct. It it would do him no harm during the presidential election. Um, I can fully understand why the Chinese don't want him to come to China at this time, and I would not be at all surprised if Blinken at some point, perhaps not on this visit, but in the weeks that we've seen building up to this visit, floated the idea of an invitation to Biden, and the Chinese quietly said, you know, it's not an appropriate time, or something
Mhm.
like that. I mean,
Mhm.
they won't have rejected it outright,
Yeah.
but they've
Mhm.
said, that this isn't the right moment for it. Which, of course, with Biden, it might never be.
And that's also possibly explain the Blinken's anger with China, right? I mean, he didn't get anything out of this trip. But you can see he himself a little bit timid with all these visits, and then
Mm,
China probably just I mean, if you from the readout, it's pretty tough against him. More straightforward. Let's put it that way,
mm.
and less like, okay, this is behind the door. We say this. Actually, a lot of the things just came out even from the readout, so he probably wasn't very happy. And to the degree, I saw his interview on CNN. He is now floating this idea that somehow China is interfering in the U.S. election. Are we talking about another Russiagate instead of Russia and this is China Gate? Are we talking about that now?
Entirely plausible, but who does China want to win? Donald Trump? I
Exactly.
mean, it hardly makes any kind of sense. But anyway, let's go back to this. But I think you're absolutely correct, by the way, about Blinken looking very uncomfortable over the course of his visit. I mean, Blinken has had a whole series of encounters with Chinese officials, going all the way back to that extraordinary meeting in Anchorage, which took place in 2021. Now, I covered that extensively on the Duran because this is an article. And I made the point, and a video, by the way, and I made the point that the Americans are not used to this kind of meeting. I mean, this is what happened at Anchorage, that the Americans came in, thinking that they would deliver their lectures to the Chinese and the Chinese would sit and listen, which is what most countries do. Even the Russians, until recently, used to do that. And of course, the Chinese are not like that at all. And I think that was shocking for him and for Jake Sullivan, who was also there. And I think ever since then, I think they've been nervous of their encounters with the Chinese. This isn't new, by the way. I remember once listening to an interview that Henry Kissinger gave. And, he had these discussions with the Chinese all the way back in the 1970s, when China was a much less powerful country, obviously, than it is now. And even then, he said that, with the Chinese, it was, they were not going to let themselves be pushed around or lectured over the course of discussions. And because he was Kissinger, he came to accept that and found a way of working with the Chinese. But with Blinken, a far lesser person altogether, I can very easily see that for him, meeting with Xi Jinping, meeting with Wang Yi must be an intimidating experience. But Chinese interference in the American election. I mean, I just, when, as opposed to American interference in Chinese affairs. I mean, what can one even say? I mean, it's just the latest fantasy that's just been floated, I suppose. Russian interference, in the end, is discredited. It's a discredited meme. So you have to come up with a new one. And again, you're going to have the usual hysterical people in the media in the United States who are probably going to run with it. I can just see Rachel Maddow
Those kind of people,
telling us all about that. But I mean, it's not as if the Chinese would have any particular desire to see Donald Trump become president again. The point I would make about Trump, actually, which is when he first met with Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago, as I remember, in 2017, they got on well. I mean, Trump, at a personal level, is someone I think you can talk to. When he goes away, well, it's different. But I mean, he doesn't have that same arrogance and, rudeness that, frankly, I think Biden does. But of course, I mean, in terms of policy, I mean, Trump is every bit as hardline as Biden is, perhaps even more. So I cannot understand why the Chinese would want to interfere in an American election, or how they would do that. I mean, how would they do that? I mean, how does China interfere in an American election? I mean, the whole idea is ridiculous. It's absurd.
Well, according to the CNN reporter, what she was saying is that there's some fake online MAGA people, that those fake people are somehow related to organization that's sponsored by China. I mean, they didn't name the organization supposedly sponsored by China. Who are these organizations, right? But they just, randomly throw out something and then saying, okay, this,
It's exactly the same story as was one of the stories during Russiagate, that there was this a troll factory supposedly in St. Petersburg in Russia that was planting stories in social media, and this operation swung the election in Trump's favor, costing no more than $100,000, apparently. I mean, it was completely discredited, by the way. I mean, there was a court case over it, and the Justice Department had to concede because it couldn't be proved. So, I mean, it's a rerun of the same story, even more absurd than it was before. I mean, what it shows is that the Americans are just running up of new stories of new narratives to make up. You say exactly the same thing about China that you once said about Russia. you hope that people's memories are so short that they won't notice that it's the identical story, but with a different villain in a fiddle filling the role.
It doesn't stop there. They're also Maria Bartiromo, she's also very anti-China on CNBC.
Mm,
She was talking to Florida's congressman, I forgot the name, but they were claiming that the student movement right now in the US, somehow China is behind that. They just,
mm,
again, randomly saying, oh, if you look closely, there's Chinese CPC money without any evidence, and then even Maria have to ask, do you have any evidence? He said, oh, we will look into that, blah, blah. It sounds like he has something, but he's not saying it.
mm.
But it doesn't stop him from spreading all these fake narratives, just to somehow China is behind that. That's what they're doing with the Hong Kong. That's the CIA money, what they were doing. In Hong Kong had a riot. But they make that story, then put it on other people, what they were doing themselves. That's,
I mean, the whole thing. The whole thing is absurd. If we're talking about the student protests, epicenter has been Columbia University,
yeah.
where of course the students, the protests have now been smashed by the New York police, who show a degree of willingness to act, which. Well, the Chinese were much slower to act in Hong Kong, just to say. But anyway, put that aside. I mean, Columbia University is Ivy League college. The fees that people pay to get in are huge, as everybody knows. These are going to be elite young people, mostly drawn from the elite of the United States. The idea that China controls them is just again. I mean, it's just beyond belief. Actually, I mean, there are Chinese students there, no doubt, but I mean, the idea
Right.
that they can influence and control and direct all the other
Hmm.
students is equally absurd. I mean, this is just. What does China gain from it?
Yeah.
What purpose for China would all this serve? I mean, again, when you take a step back and think about it, it's a story that just doesn't make sense. But you put out these stories there, you build up a narrative for Americans that China is this kind of adversary. No
Hmm.
evidence for that, also, by the way. And eventually, when everybody is saying this, China is doing this, it's interfering in the elections, it's destroying American jobs, it's doing all of it, people start to believe it. They start working up
Hmm.
and start accepting that this narrative is true. A very good question, by the way, one which really there's no ultimately satisfactory answer for, is why does the United States consider China to be an adversary at all?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. And I guess the answer to them, to the neocon neoliberal is China stopped I mean, China doesn't buy into this hegemony thing. I guess that's why.
well,
That's
that's
what,
right.
yeah.
Well, that's right. But ultimately, an even more real
Hmm.
reason is that
Yeah.
China is a country that has developed, grown strong, become rich, is industrially powerful, and that's ultimately what the United States doesn't like.
Yeah. And
But
it's
it
always
doesn't want to,
fascinating.
doesn't, yeah, go on.
I mean, it's always fascinating to me that the United States, geographically, very safe
Mm,
country, right, with
mm,
protected with the two oceans, and they
mm,
have rich natural resource. I mean, why why can't we
mm,
just live a good life?
yeah.
Living here
Well,
in the United States.
Well, this is of course what the founders of the United States always said that it should do, and it's what George Washington said, and John Quincy Adams said,
Mhm.
and all of these people said, let's focus on building up the United States. Let's not get
Mhm.
involved in other people's affairs.
Yeah. And
Well,
in Eurasia, if there's a conflict there, let them do it, right? We just
yeah,
stay out of it and
yeah,
live our good life. And and
yeah,
and they can't let that be. It's
no,
just
no,
fascinating to me.
yes,
And talking about the student movements is that's one thing also got a lot of attention in China because during the Hong Kong riot, Nancy Pelosi very famously said it's a beautiful sight to behold. Now that has been used since then in any kind of
mm,
a problems in the US, right? When there's a
mm,
January 6th and people saying, and now it's really truly the beautiful sight to behold.
yeah,
It
no,
just it's come back to haunt you, so you never
mhm,
should do those kind of things, say those kind of thing, right? Because you never know it comes
mm.
back to haunt you. And it does. It is sometimes quicker than you think, I think.
Absolutely, you're completely right. You should never say things like that. Well, but of course, the Americans never have that ability to reflect in that kind of way. I mean, if Nancy Pelosi says something like that, that's fine. If people come back and say that about the United States,
Mhm.
that's unacceptable. It's, that's outrageous in some ways. Never do to the United States that which it does to others.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, the Elon Musk visit to China, which is also pretty interesting. It's unannounced, like, kind of like all of a sudden he had visited. So the Chinese media is reporting, and I think the U.S. media also reported that his purpose is to now his Tesla has encountered some problems. So part of the
Mm,
problem is there has not been much of an innovation. So what
mm,
he's doing now is he's doing this full self-driving FSD. Now, in order to do that, he needs the data to do the training of the AI. But in the past, the Chinese government hasn't given him the green light to do so, to use the data he collected in China
mm,
to do the training, to use the software and develop software to train the
mm.
AI. But apparently, this trip they did agree to that he could do that. So that's being regarded as a big breakthrough, and so that's why his stock went up like 15-20% or something. So that's the purpose. I find it interesting because for him, he wanted to make this a big deal because it's looking good for his stocks. But the Chinese government also uses this as a good PR as well, because that also to put a very strong contrast to what the U.S. is doing for TikTok. Do you think that's the purpose also?
You are absolutely correct on every point. I mean, Elon Musk has to try and come to some kind of an understanding with China because, of course, he built his entire fortune ultimately on the electric car revolution. In fact, in the West, he created it. I mean, and, all credit to him. He did it
Hmm.
brilliantly in some respects. But you're absolutely correct. He could only take this so far. The technology is now stagnating. I mean, there was talk about graphite batteries some years ago, but that never really appeared on the scene. And he has to move a whole step upwards, and he can't do that by himself. And China has this enormous industrial and technological power in terms of, and not just EVs, but everything connected with EVs. So he makes the pragmatic business-like decision, which is first and foremost talk to the Chinese and try to work on a win-win solution, which is what the Chinese always say. And Elon Musk, who by the way I have encountered, I've been on a program with him, so I developed some understanding of his mind. I can absolutely see that he would do that. He's that kind of pragmatic businessman, and the Chinese like working with pragmatic business people. And it is completely different, as you rightly say, from TikTok, because the Chinese like to work with people like they don't see them as a threat. They look to build relationships and build bridges. And yes, it is an example of something that's been done, which is in contrast to the TikTok affair. And beyond that, by the way, to the Huawei affair and all of those other
Uh-huh.
affairs. It does
Yeah.
show a completely different business culture. But of course, it also creates a bridge with an important American businessman, a very important American company. Remember that um, Musk is not just important now in electric cars. He's got, his various other projects, that the ones in space and all that.
All right.
So, there's lots of connections and interconnections and work that you can do with him. So I think it's a good example of how business relations should be conducted in a straightforward, business-like and pragmatic way, and everyone wins.
Yeah, that's something interesting, because it seems like and it's not just the Tesla, but also Apple. Tim Cook not that long ago visited China as well. Opened his
Yeah.
store, big giant store in Shanghai, Apple store.
Mm.
It seems like a business. There are plenty of people still want to do business in China, and I feel like China also more and more confident as well. They are not afraid of the competition because EV there's a lot of EV companies in China. but they're not afraid that Tesla, coming up with better advanced products or technology, etc. In fact, some people are saying that Chinese government actually like these kind of competition because
Yeah.
that will make the domestic car manufacturers even better. And so I feel like and in the meantime, also, my husband got invited by Chinese university, so we're going to China next month. And not just him, but we know other people in the academia world also get invited to go to visit China, etc. It seems like there's a disconnection. The government, the U.S. government, foreign policy versus the academia world versus the business world, and of course the public, how they feel about all these wars, all these hostile conflicts and those tough talks. It seems that there's a big disconnection there, what the government do versus the rest of the country. It's
I,
not just the
I,
regular people, but also businesses.
I don't think there's any doubt about this. I mean, let's talk about, imposing the kind of sanctions on China that the US has imposed on Russia. What would that do to Apple? I mean, Apple would probably collapse. Just a key American business. In fact, it would be a catastrophe for
Mhm.
the US if it took that approach. The business people understand this very well. That's why they don't want to see it happen. Um, we've seen problems for Germany when they cut off the uh, energy link with Russia. For the American business world, cutting off the well-established link with the world's other great economy, one which in manufacturing terms and global trade terms is now much bigger than the US's, would be a complete disaster. And of course, what it would do to inflation in the United States if Chinese products suddenly were withdrawn from the American markets. Again, it would be a disaster. It would be a disaster for American consumers, which means ultimately American families. It would send inflation soaring. It would cause a huge amount of trouble. Now, business people understand that. I think ordinary people, if they are given the facts, understand that very well. I think in China itself, you're absolutely right. I think the Chinese economy has now evolved and developed to the point where it has no fear of competition. It is enormous. I mean, for every Tesla, there are multiple Chinese car companies that do that, and having some competition, as you rightly say, is a good thing. Besides, I mean, it's important to say that China has been open to trade with the world since the 1970s. This isn't new. So,
Yes.
it makes complete sense from the Chinese point of view that they would welcome something like this. It makes no sense for the United States to seek a confrontation with China. Business people understand that. Academics understand it. Ordinary people understand it. The problem is that those who wield power in Washington, we've discussed this many times, come from a very small, selected, self-selecting group
Mhm.
made up of the military industrial companies, the intelligence services, the NGOs that prop them all up. And they see the world in completely different terms. And I'm afraid they are leading the United States down a very, very bad path. And I think people like Elon Musk, who's increasingly outspoken, by the way, can
Mhm.
see it and they say it.
Yeah. And one more thing is that Xi Jinping is going to visit Europe
Mm.
um, May 5th, and he will visit France, Serbia, and Hungary. So I think that's also another thing China is doing, is trying to win over Europe from
Mm.
the US.
Yes.
Is that how you see
I
the
agree. He's
yeah.
doing two things. Firstly, he's going to two countries that are already good friends of China, Serbia and Hungary. And he's reminding the Europeans, look, we do have friends in Europe already, friends that benefit from their trade with us. And then he's going to France, one of the key European countries, second in importance only to Germany. He's
Mm,
had a good relationship in the past with Emmanuel Macron, the president of
mhm.
France, and he wants to build on that too. And he wants to try to get the French, in particular, Macron in particular, to tell the other Europeans, look, we've already got ourselves into a mess with the Russians. We don't want another mess with China as well. China is not a threat to us. It's far away. It wants to trade with us. It's a friendly country. It's got so much to offer. France, I think I'm right in saying, was the first Western country, member of the Western Alliance, to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China.
Yeah,
I think I'm right in saying that.
yeah.
And, build and develop that relationship and work with the Chinese. It's worked for France before, and it should work for Europe as a whole as well. So I think that's the purpose of his visit.
Now, do you think Macron is kind of frustrated right now with the Ukrainian situation? There
Mm,
doesn't seem like there's a whole lot they can do at this point now. It's going to collapse, and it's just a matter of time. I'm not even sure that 61 billion will make any difference
no.
to last it that long. So he has to look beyond the Ukraine war now, has to look at the France interest in general. Because one thing that the trip is going to do apparently is Xi Jinping going to Hungary to visit or opening a EV car manufacturer in Hungary. Some people even say that could be a game changer for Hungary because Hungary has good relationship with both Russia and China, has cheap energy compared to others. And with collaborations with China, Hungary could be an important industry power. And so France should know that, right? France certainly should be aware of all these developments. So France does need at this point need to see beyond the Ukraine war, moving forward, and that needs China to work with China. Is
Oh,
that?
this is absolutely correct. You're entirely correct. I should add, by the way, that historically Hungary and France have always had good relations. I mean, they've been two countries which, going way back into the Middle Ages, have always been on good terms, and where there's been an awful lot of cultural interchange historically between France and Hungary. So, you know, those connections are there. And yes, I mean it would be sane, rational for the French to do this. As you rightly say, the Ukraine war is going to end in a
Mhm.
terrible defeat. They're going to have a Russia on their doorstep, which they have completely antagonized. Now the Russians are, tough-minded people. They're also emotional people, by the way. I mean, I think that's a thing to add about them. I mean, they're very, very angry at the moment.
Mhm.
Um, you have to find ultimately some way back with the Russians. How are you going to do that? Well, the Americans aren't going to help you. So you work with Russia's friend, which is China, which has influence in Moscow and which is liked there. I mean,
Mhm.
I say influence. I want to make it clear. I mean, I'm not suggesting that the Chinese are pulling any levers in Moscow,
Mhm.
but they can talk to the Russians and they can give advice to the Russians, and I think the Russians would listen to that advice and they would help in that kind of a way. So yes, if you were Macron, that's exactly what you should be trying to do, and at times Macron talks as if he understands these things. The trouble is, he's also a volatile man. One day he says sensible, rational things.
Yeah.
Other days he says crazy things,
Okay.
like sending French troops to Russia and needing to defeat Russia and all of that kind of thing. So he's uh, he's not an entirely easy person to work with. But it's also perhaps important to say that at least he can listen. He will listen to what Xi Jinping says. And he may not be there anyway for very long because
Mhm.
his term is ending.
Mhm.
Conceivably, the next French president, whoever that is, will be more willing to listen to what the Chinese are saying. And in order to get yourself in a position where you can have discussions in future with the new French president, you need to maintain the dialogue with France now.
Mhm. And going back to Blinken, after he left China, then he went to Saudi, right? This is his sixth or seventh visit to the Middle East.
Mm.
But he has been there many times. I just don't feel like he generated much result. What was he doing there? Other than just being there and then seems like talking to everybody, but then make everybody more angry. Feels like.
Well, Well, he has this great plan, which has been the Biden administration plan, to try to create peace in the Middle East by getting Saudi Arabia to agree to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. Except, of course, that isn't going to happen because the Saudis have said that they can't do that until the issue of Palestine has been resolved. But this is again the American habit that they can't give up on a strategy or adapt it to changing events. So he comes back to Saudi Arabia. He talks to the Saudis. He says the same things that he said on the 5 other occasions that he's been there. The Saudis politely listen, and they tell him the same thing back. He goes away, and then he comes back a few months later and says the same thing. It's very much, unfortunately, the American style at the moment.
And if they're trying to solve the problem, it doesn't seem like they're making any progress because it's clear that the Israel is going to go into Rafah. Because I just saw that it says that Netanyahu says Israel will invade Gaza's Rafah with or without a hostage deal, which means there's no point to have a hostage deal, right?
Well,
So
that's
they're going
right.
to do that, and Blinken doesn't seem to do anything about it, even though he was
Well,
there.
Well, this is exactly true. I mean, the thing is that the Americans are talking to the wrong people. They want the Saudis to make concessions, whereas the country that needs to make the concessions is Israel, because it's Israel's policy that is creating the crisis. But of course, the Biden administration won't acknowledge that.
Yeah, and then going back to China, actually, Hamas and Fatah they just had a meeting in Beijing, and they are expressing their will to seek reconciliation. And
Mm.
according to the Chinese media, I didn't see much reported on the West, is that they actually making progress. So that seems like one thing China is doing, but it doesn't seem like anybody could stop Israel from going into Rafah. That seems like it's just very tragic, which also going back related to the student movement in the US, that student really can't see, they can't stand it anymore, right?
Well,
So domestically, foreign policy is related. And it seems like the Biden administration is totally powerless now, right now. They don't know what to do either way, seems like.
Well, this is exactly correct again. I mean, the fact is the Chinese are, again, taking a much more realistic approach. They're saying, how are we going to deal with this situation? We have to get negotiations underway between Israel and the Palestinians. That means we've got to have the Palestinians all together working towards negotiations
Mhm.
with Israel. That means we have to try to bring the various Palestinian factions together. That's why we're hosting meetings between Hamas and the and Fatah.
Mm.
And well, you know, eventually the Chinese might be able to achieve that effect. But of course, that's not what the Americans are going to do because the Americans won't talk to Hamas at all because they want the world just to sit back and to let Israel do whatever it wants to do and ultimately keep silent. And at the end of that, it wants the Saudis, once Hamas has been destroyed and Gaza has been obliterated and tens upon tens of thousands of people have been killed, Saudi Arabia to make peace with Israel on Israeli terms. And again, that isn't going to happen. But it's again very much the style that the Americans insist on getting what they want and won't compromise. And diplomacy is all about compromise in the end. That's why the Americans aren't good at it.
And this rumor, ICC is considering to issue arrest warrant for Netanyahu. Apparently, the U.S. government is putting a lot of pressure on the ICC, including even the Speaker Johnson is saying something they're going to sanction the ICC. And again, that is a lot of things that people are paying attention. It is one thing that people pay a lot of attention in China is that the hypocrisy there, right? That they issued an arrest warrant for Putin based on there's baseless. There's no concrete evidence what he did with the children. They suppose that he smuggled the children, whatever. He was trying to protect those children.
Yeah.
But here we have a clear evidence of a genocide, and they haven't issued any arrest warrant yet. And yet the U.S. already putting pressure, saying, "Don't you dare!"
Yeah.
Right? Isn't that another hypocrisy thing that going on?
Well, of course it is. It's again another wonderful demonstration of American values, if I could say so. I mean, America is not a party to the Rome Statute, which founded the ICC. Not only is it not a party to the Rome Statute, but it insists that if the ICC ever dares issue warrants against American officials, the United States will come along and arrest the people of the ICC. You should actually see the statement the State Department published some years ago on this very topic, and it's eye-watering. I mean, it's astonishing. The ICC, which is under enormous amount of criticism and pressure from around the world, precisely because they did what they did. They issued that, as you completely correctly said, ridiculous, empty warrant against Putin because Western governments wanted them to, basically. They've dragged their feet on issuing warrants against Israel, despite the fact that, as you correctly said, there's a genocide going on. The ICC's international credibility is collapsing. The ICC, therefore, in order to preserve its credibility, decides that it has to finally take action, so it's now thinking about issuing warrants. And the United States, which isn't a party to the Rome Statute, always insists that the independence of courts must be completely respected. There must be no interference at all in their work. What's it now doing? It's threatening the ICC with sanctions and telling the ICC don't do that. I mean, if this happens, if it plays out like that, the reputation of the ICC will be destroyed. It will be seen as an institution that just does what the Americans tell it to do, even though, as I said, the Americans are not party to it. So it will destroy the international credibility of the ICC. It will also expose, yet again, the reality of what American foreign policy is all about and how it conducts itself. So the hypocrisy is incredible. It's off the scale, but it's part of the way the US behaves. And, it won't stop Blinken or his successor coming to Beijing and talking about values all over again, even though we see what those values really mean.
And also, they know what's going on, right? I mean, there's also Israeli report about Annalena Baerbock apparently confronted Netanyahu, showing on her phone some of the starving children in Gaza, and apparently make Netanyahu very angry. So for whatever reason, that got leaked, and so it was reported on the Israeli media. And so, at the same time, also Blinken also knows because there are internal memos just telling him that there are plenty of people telling him that what Israel saying, Israel are telling the U.S. State Department, okay, we are following we're not violating international law. But the officials in the State Department saying they don't believe that. So Blinken and Annalena Baerbock, I mean, these people, they know what's going on, but they don't care, right? They don't.
No.
They don't put sanctions or criticize Netanyahu or anything, right? They don't care.
They don't care because ultimately they see Netanyahu as one of them. He's one of their team, so they protect him. It's as simple as this. I mean, we hear an awful lot about values, human rights, all of that, but much more. The better way to understand the West is as a kind of gang that all its members are supposed to stick together. And if one of them sort of transgresses in some way, the job of the others is to protect him.
Very when you read those things, it's they just I mean they already lost all the credibility. But still, I was surprised that and privately Annalena Baerbock actually confronted Netanyahu. So which means it does bother her to see those pictures,
Oh yeah.
right? And yet he can't bring herself up to just to confront Netanyahu in
No.
a more forceful way, in a public way, to put pressure on Israel. That's just
No, of course,
shameful. I think it's
absolutely.
shameful.
Absolutely, and I mean not only that, but the same German government whose foreign minister is confronting Netanyahu with all of these pictures is sending the police to break up a meeting of people who want to discuss the genocide in Gaza, the meeting in Berlin. And I know all about that because a person who I used to know, Yanis Varoufakis, we were at school together in Greece. He was one of the people who was invited to that meeting, and of course he now can't go to Germany. But there it is. I mean, we are. That's the West we have today. Genocide is fine, provided it's being conducted by one of us. If someone else, you know, does something, breaks up a protest in Hong Kong, all the
Yeah,
world complains, there's massive uproar. I'll give another example of hypocrisy. I mean, there's been 2 mass graves discovered in
that's right.
Gaza over the last couple of days. You know, you wouldn't know about it. If you read the British media, there's been a few little articles squirreled away in a few places, the same in the American media. You remember 2 years ago when the Russians pulled back from close near Kiev, there were a few bodies of people found in this suburb of Kiev called Bucha. There are people, a few bodies, about a score of people, I think, altogether, lying around. Apparently, they were actually killed as a result of artillery fire, just saying. But we had days and weeks of relentless stories about Russian atrocities in Bucha. But a whole genocide with mass graves being discovered? Well, we don't talk about that.
I just feel it's shameful. I mean,
Mm.
I never really think highly about Annalena Baerbock, but after that, I just feel like she lost total credibility. You know,
Well,
she's German. You know, I have a lot of respect for German people, but it's just so disappointing. Yeah,
oh, yeah, I agree with that.
yeah.
Absolutely. Well, my wife is half German, so
Okay,
I have lots of connections with Germany, but you know, I completely share your feelings.
okay. Ukraine. Now, do you think this 61 billion would make Ukraine last until November? I got the feeling it can collapse any day now.
Yeah.
Is that
Yeah.
your
Yes. The word yes. Now, of course, bear in mind, I'm not a military officer and I
uh-huh.
don't have all the information about what is happening on the ground. But my sense is that we are looking at a slow motion collapse, and it's slow motion at the moment, but that motion is getting faster. So a whole series of positions have just been captured. There's this town called Chasov Yar, which is apparently at risk of falling as well. And the military chief of Ukraine, a man called Syrskyi, is now talking about the need for Ukraine to retreat from particular positions. So he has always had the reputation of wanting to defend every position to the last man. So when he's talking about retreat, then you can tell that things are really very bad.
Mhm.
And there's also rumors that Ukrainian military units are now increasingly refusing to obey orders. They won't attack when they're ordered to. In 1 or 2 cases, there have been mass surrenders. A lot of that apparently now going on. So I can't give a date
Mhm.
when I can say definitely it's going to collapse now or in a week's time or in a month's time. Some people who know more about war than me can probably give those dates more accurately. But it really does look to me as if we are now starting to look at a collapse, a gradual collapse. And I think the $61 billion isn't going to make any difference. I think it's going to be submerged in the flood. I mean, the situation is far out of control. And by the way, this morning, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a statement by the Russian Defense Minister, and he, for the first time, said that there was an offensive, that the Russian army is on the offensive. So there you go. I mean, the Russians have been very careful up to now to avoid using the word offensive to describe what's happening. Now that they've actually used it for the first time, I think that's a further sign that they're increasingly confident that things are going according to plan.
And in fact, actually, one of the things that the Chinese media discuss, I actually agree, is that the fact that Ukraine is collapsing and the things are not going very well in Gaza actually could be one reason the Biden administration want to do something to stir something in the Pacific, because that would distract all these failures, right? Make it a spectacle, and then all the attention goes there. Because as soon as the October 7th happens, the attention does move from Ukraine to Gaza, right? And so make it, if there is a collapse there, maybe people don't pay much attention. For elections, it's all about PR, right? About optics and all that sort of thing. And they can make up some stories, make up some excuses, and it's all China's fault, whatever, and for the collapse. And of course, going into Rafah doesn't make Israel look good. It will only make it, country more people around the world more angry, etc., including the Western public, etc. So that could be actually, in a way, if there's something happened there in the Pacific, in China, could pull all the attention there. That actually could be one motivations. What do you
Well,
think?
what I'm going to say is a few things. Firstly, I mean, if you go back to Blinken's statement just before he left China. I mean, part of it was clearly addressed to the American people, and it was an election address, and it was already trying to paint China as the country that goes and destroys American jobs and all of that, and the Biden administration trying to protect Americans and their livelihoods and that kind of thing. Now, on the biggest story of the US, of the administration becoming increasingly desperate and trying to engineer a war or a conflict with China in the Pacific, there's two things to say. Firstly, I think there are some people in the administration who are crazy enough to do a thing like that and who are crazy enough to think it. But I have to also say that I think that this is such a crazy idea that I think, on balance, within the wider US government, there will be a lot of opposition because they will say, well, yeah, we perhaps are not entirely opposed to war with China or a conflict with China, but we absolutely do not want to start one in a rush simply in order to get Joe Biden across the finishing line in November. We want to do it at a time and place of our choosing when we are ready and the Chinese are not. So, I mean, I think that is the view that is probably going to dominate in Washington over the next few weeks and months. But with this administration, it is always very difficult to be sure. There's always a tendency to, do reckless and dangerous things, and that isn't impossible at all.
Yeah, let's hope you're right, right? Because, yeah, I also think it's crazy. But there are people, there are countries in the world, other than US and China. Actually, there are plenty of countries want to see China and US have a war. For example, I mean, in China, they're saying Japan, for example. Japan would be fine to see. Now, Japan doesn't want to fight China itself, but Japan would be fine with US and China fight, right? Turkey probably is another one that is always looking for something, etc. I mean, those are the things I can think of. But if US and China does get into a hot war, don't you think there's a lot of spots in the world that can be risky, could be questionable that something will
Oh,
happen?
if we start getting into a confrontation between China and the United States, then I mean that it would be such an epochal event that it would easily start all kinds of problems, flare-ups in all sorts of places. Countries around the world would start to say the entire international system is collapsing. This is our moment, therefore, to make our own move, and let's do so. And you can see people like Erdogan in Turkey and
Mhm.
the Japanese government and all kinds of people jumping in. I have to say, they'd be wrong to think that. I think that ultimately every country in the world benefits from a stable international system. And I think far more countries in the world do not want to see a confrontation between China and the US than want to see it. But obviously, there are some people who are reckless enough, crazy enough, and stupid enough. And I have to say, the Japanese government at the moment is one of them,
Oh,
that I can imagine that they would do and act and behave in that kind of way. One country, by the way, which importantly does not, is Russia.
mhm.
I mean, you'd have thought that the Russians would be only too delighted to see a confrontation between China and the United States, but they're level-headed enough to know that that would, you know, be an absolute epochal disaster, and it should be avoided at all costs. And I mean, I don't think they're going to give any advice to the Chinese on this
Yeah.
because they don't need that advice. But I think that that's absolutely their view. When I read the Russian media, that's absolutely the line they take.
Yeah, that's one of the things that a commentator who used to be in the Chinese military, he actually was talking to his counterpart. He actually pointed that out. He said that, if US really pick up this fight with China, you need to know that there's a lot of places you simply will lose control.
Yeah.
And actually he said that his counterpart agrees. That everybody can see that. That
Oh, absolutely.
it's going to be
I,
chaotic everywhere. Yeah.
it will be chaotic. I mean, even the Russians who do not want to see a war. I mean, if a conflict starts between China and the US, they may feel obliged.
Hmm.
They feel that they have to do things which they might not want to do, like, for example, bring the Baltic states under control. Because
Hmm.
in a global confrontation of this kind, um, it would be too dangerous to allow the Baltic states to remain hostile to Russia, and a potential bridge into Russia from some hostile Western country. So it would be a mad thing to do, to create a war between China and the US. And it would certainly set, I mean, it would light a fuse, which would be very difficult to put out.
Okay. Little bit light things. I just read that there is Boeing airplane has a lot of trouble. So the latest one, there's a Delta flight. Apparently, when it was taking off, there is this emergency slide fell out of the plane, and so they have to have emergency landing. Well, and then they couldn't find this slide. And then this happened, I think, last Friday. And then yesterday or the day before yesterday, it showed up. This slide, emergency slide, showed up outside a beach house of a lawyer who is now suing Boeing for this Alaska incident. The door dropped in midair. What's the odd of that? I just find that's interesting. My question to you is that now I find that the whole thing about Boeing's quality is stunning because it's Boeing we're talking about, and
Mhm.
Boeing is very special in the U.S. Amongst all the companies. The Boeing's CEOs always have direct contact with the president, U.S. president, whoever is the president, right? And yet they seems like this downfall is incredible that they could just become this um, the US brand for quality, etc. And to now, everybody is talking, okay, we should avoid a Boeing flight now. So
Yeah.
what happened? It's Boeing overly, I think the government is overly protective of Boeing. Is that part of the problem?
I think it's exactly right. I mean, I think also, I mean, Boeing has been caught up in the general malaise that has afflicted all of American industry as the United States moved from being, the great industrial economy that it was only, within recent memory, 30 years ago, and became a financialized economy based on services and financial engineering, proper industrial processes and engineering just basically petered out. And I think that's what's happened. And like yourself, I'm astonished. I mean, the idea that the company that made the Boeing 747, that built all those incredible aircraft before, the 707 as well, which I remember from my childhood, the first properly successful jet plane, if I have to say, that it should be facing this kind of crisis is just almost beyond, it beggars belief. I'm going to say it bluntly, I think that, in 10 years, we can all look forward to the day when we are all flying safely on Chinese aircraft, because that's the future. I mean, I think Airbus is in Europe is probably a little way behind where Boeing is, but I don't think much. But as I said, Chinese aircraft, and China, as you know, is building up its aircraft industry on a huge scale.
Yeah.
Chinese aircraft are probably the way things are going to go.
Yeah.
Russia's also doing quite a lot of work from that area too, by the way. But of course,
Yeah.
China is going to be the big player.
Yeah, that would be another area of probably conflict or attention, because in order to fly Chinese aircraft, that they need permission from the US FAA. And so far, US FAA has not been issuing these things, even though they are they are flying airplanes in China already in service that could be going onto the market, but because they don't have that permission, so they cannot really sell them. So that's another area of it's coming
Of course it is. But then what will happen, of course, is this. You're going to start getting a situation where Chinese aircraft are going to be used in China, a much bigger domestic market than the US itself, remember. Eventually, more and more countries which will want safe aircraft at competitive prices will want to buy them from China as well. They will gradually shift away from the American regulatory systems because that's inevitable. And Boeing, with its poor quality controls, which it's been trying to fix for years now and seems to be making no progress in, will gradually wither. And of course, at that point, the next generation of American politicians will do what they're doing now, which is blame China. They'll say the problem is not the fact that Boeing lost its way, it's that the Chinese have developed overcapacity and have engaged in unfair competition.
Yeah. It's because one other thing, I talked about what the US want China to do to buy the agricultural products or buy the treasury bonds. They also want China to buy Boeing airplanes.
Oh,
They
yes.
ask that too. But with Boeing's, I feel like even the government wants to buy it with so many problems. Do they really dare? I mean, if something happens, people will blame the Chinese government saying, why do you buy these planes when you know there are problems, right? So it's getting harder. Even Chinese government wants to.
Well, of course, absolutely, but I mean, and I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there will be growing resistance to buying Boeings in China, and but not just in China. The difference is China can make its own planes, and it can do so again in industrial quantities. It can build an aerospace industry like the one that the US used to have. It can do it. It has that capacity. In my opinion, there's only 3 countries in the world that have the technological and industrial resources to maintain aerospace industries. One is China, the other is the United States at a much lower level, the third is Russia. I mean, they do build civil aircraft, and they're now building more of them, partly because the Americans won't let them buy Boeings. So I mean, anyway, there we go. But when we get into a situation where Boeings are no longer wanted either in China or in the rest of the world because they're seen as dangerous, the industry that is going to benefit is going to be China's, because China has the quality control and the engineering depth and the economies of scale that will enable it to build an industry like this and make it successful. And again, the Americans shouldn't fear this competition.
Yeah.
What they should do is sort out the problems of Boeing, which are not beyond solution.
Mhm.
But of course, they're not. They're not. They don't seem to have the systems, the management systems that would enable them to do that.
Yeah. Their focus is all about wars, all about other countries. They're
Focus is
not
well.
focusing. Yeah.
Well, I think that's part of the problem with Boeing itself. By the way, I think Boeing, from having been an aerospace company with its center of gravity in civil aviation, has to a great extent now become a military industrial company, with all the problems that flow from that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very unfortunate. Yeah, ever since they bought McDonnell Douglas, I think it went downhill from there.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Yeah.
That lots of people agree on that. Yes.
Mm.
Okay. Maybe next time we can talk about the Chinese space. They have some,
Oh yeah.
the space program. Yeah, we can talk
And
about that next time. Yeah.
we certainly should. It's very important, and of course, again, it'll be another area where we're going to be hearing before long that the Chinese have overcapacity. I have
Yeah.
to say, I find the overcapacity thing is so. I mean, if you want to take a humorous view, it is so funny. I mean, what we're basically hearing is China, your economy is too big. That's what it really is all about. You got too big an economy. You must cut yourself down, make yourself small again.
You're too competitive because there is
You're
not
too
even
competitive.
Chinese EV car in the US. They haven't come yet, but they're coming. Supposedly, some are coming, get through some way through Volvo, and Geely is one of the company that coming in July. We'll see what happens. And in China, all the top brands, they are actually waiting list for their cars. So there is no evidence whatsoever that there is overcapacity. Even in China, there is no.
The whole thing is completely absurd. I mean, it is so ridiculous that I mean, it just doesn't. I mean, in any sane world, people would be laughing at this about this overcapacity thing.
Yeah. Okay, let's stop there. I know you're busy. Thank you so much. It's another interesting talking.
Have a great day, Sophia, and we'll speak again next week.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.